Okay, we're in week 3 of beginning clinical skills in cultural responsive therapy, and we're going to talk about microaggressions and implicit bias today. This is just going to be an overview to kind of get you started for the week. At the end of this overview, the objectives are that you will be able to define microaggressions and implicit bias, be able to name the key figures for microaggression and implicit bias, and be able to discuss the clinical implications for and relevance of the concepts of microaggressions and implicit biases. So we're going to start out with what are microaggressions? And just like before we go too much further, we're going to hear in the words of one of the key figures. Um, and then we'll also hear from another of the key figures.
Microaggressions are the everyday slights, indignities, put downs, and validations that people experience, that people of color experience in their day to day interactions with well intentioned, well meaning people who are unaware that they have delivered a put down or invalidation.
So that was from Dr. Daryl Wing Su, who is one of the key figures, but is not the coiner of the concept of microaggressions. Um, we're gonna listen to a recording from the coiner of from Dr. Chester Pierce, who is the coiner of the concept of microaggressions. Now, I could not find any video of Dr. Pierce at all. Which was surprising because Dr. Pierce passed away in 2016. I thought there would be some video. I found a couple different audio recordings. None of them explicitly talk about microaggressions, but there is this one where he's talking about something else, and what he's describing are microaggressions. So it gives you um, he's describing microaggressions, and he's talking also about like discrimination. But it gives you an idea of like where he was at and how he like came about this concept, even if we don't actually get to hear him talk about it explicitly in his own words. This is a little bit quiet. I've got it up as loud as I can, but you may need to turn up your sound a little bit once he gets started talking.
Well, the Black Caucus took place in Miami of May 1969. Prior to that time, there had been a lot of general effort by black psychiatrists to get together. The first of which originated in St. Louis perhaps 3 years before, at which time a group of psychiatrists got together feeling it was necessary for us to communicate and to establish lines of communication, and hopefully establish a registry. As a result of this, Charlie Wilkinson in Kansas City was the chief person in getting a grant from NIMH to allow us to meet, which a group of maybe 13 finally met over a period of a year. And these 13 people merely tried to establish lines of communication, what could be done in terms of establishing a registry. The grant was a small grant, and that's all we had money then to meet, and that ended that. In the meantime, there were a lot of difficulties going on, particularly in the Washington area, where there are 55 black psychiatrists. And they invited me to come talk to them after I had written a letter to the former Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, Mr. Gardner, accusing the National Institute of Mental Health of being a racist organization. I had first said this in the APA meeting in Boston, perhaps the year before, but I met Mr. Gardner at a lunch one time and expressed all this to him. He told me to put it in writing, which I did. And the burden of it was that on the night Martin Luther King got killed, the 13 black psychiatrists were meeting, and we could think of only 4 people who had ever been site visitors, consultants, review members, or advisors to the National Institute of Mental Health, which spends some $400 million a year, and all 4 of us who had ever done this that we knew of were sitting at the table. and we knew that at least some of these projects where literally millions of dollars were being given away was involving black people, and there was no black input. And without going into an extensive defense, it's quite obvious that a black man sitting in those review sessions, like I was one, was appalled that the racism went on, and just in terms of how things were voted. One black man sitting on a review board with 25 people, of course, doesn't make any kind of input. I felt that the National Institute of Mental Health could do better as an agency. It was probably more liberal than most agencies, and that they could easily just change the character of themselves by having more black consultants and more black in-house people. They'd never had a black resident. At that time, they'd only had 2 blacks who had ever been staff members, one of whom was with us that night that Martin Luther King died. That was Jim Comer, and he was getting ready to leave to go back to Yale, to assume his academic career, to resume it. So that, at any rate, I put all this into a letter to Gardner, and the people in Washington heard about it, and they asked me to come and talk to them about certain problems they had. And it was from this that then we decided we should have more confrontation with the people in IMH. Al Cannon and I had been talking about this for a number of years, about the certain agencies in government which could be changed merely by having more black input. And so that Cannon and I then got together and we asked Dr. Yolis, who was the director of the National Institute of Mental Health, and Dr. English, who was the head of the section of HEW that included the National Institute of Mental Health, to come visit at Harvard. And they came and made a visit, and that was the first time that a group of black psychiatrists confronted people within NIMH. This was all subsequent to the letter to Mr. Gardner, which he then passed on to the people in the federal government.
There you got to hear Dr. Chester Pierce talk a little bit about what he was experiencing as a black man in the field. And we're going to talk about microaggressions definition, and then we'll go on to talk more about those key figures again. So right now, according to the Oxford Review, microaggressions are subtle, often unintentional, verbal or nonverbal behaviors that convey bias or reinforce stereotypes towards marginalized groups. They can be expressed through comments, questions, jokes, gestures, or assumptions that, while not always meant to cause harm, can undermine somebody's identity, sense of belonging, or self-worth. So going back to key figures, Dr. Chester M. Pierce was born in 1927 in Glen Cove, New York, and died in 2016 in Boston, Massachusetts. He was a professor of psychiatry at Harvard. He coined the term microaggression in the 1970s across multiple works. He was the first African-American member and president in the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology. He was the first African-American full professor at the Massachusetts General Hospital, and he was a senior consultant for the acclaimed educational children's television series Sesame Street, which, as much as all of the rest of this is like amazing that he did, that was the one when I was looking this up where I was like, oh, look. So that's kind of cool that he was one of the senior consultants for that show. And Sesame Street's really culturally important show that impacted so many lives. And so through that, he impacted even more lives than he already had. And then Daryl Wing Sue is another key figure. He was born in 1943 in Portland, Oregon. He is a professor of psychology and education at Columbia University. I think right now, he's, at this point, he's an emeritus professor. He expanded microaggressions concept to psychological literature. So Dr. Pierce was a medical doctor and psychiatrist, and Dr. Daryl Wing Sue expanded this to psychological literature, especially racial microaggressions. He really started in 2007. If you go look at his bibliography, really the first time I see the word microaggressions in a title of a piece is starting in 2007. Although he did a lot of work even before then around similar concepts. He won the 2019 APA Award for Lifetime Contributions to Psychology. He co-founded the Asian American Psychological Association, and he published a book called Counseling the Culturally Diverse Theory and Practice in 1981 that was really controversial, folks. So that was kind of an important thing that he did, this idea of like working with culturally diverse folks. So, moving on from definitions and key figures, we are going to talk about clinical impacts. What does this mean for you as new clinicians and early career clinicians? Um, what do microaggressions mean for you when it comes to self as a therapist? When it comes to self as a therapist and those ideas of like that continuing work that we have to do about ourselves and our own understandings and reactions to things. Um, we need to know that microaggressions are often unintentional, but that doesn't mean they're not still harmful. We almost never mean like they can't be on purpose, but very often we do not mean to commit microaggressions, and we may not even be aware that we did, but that doesn't change how harmful they are. We need to know that no matter how much work we do, therapists can and do still commit microaggressions. Microaggressions often happen around implicit biases and cultural assumptions. So we think on this, further this week around implicit biases. We're about to talk about that in a second. We think back to last week about like cultural humility, right, and intersections. They often happen around stereotypes, and they often happen around our areas of privilege, things that we just don't have to be aware of because they don't impact us or we don't experience them. And we need to constantly be reflecting on where we feel comfort and discomfort with this and sitting with that so that we can grow. What do microaggressions mean for your clients? In clinical sessions, and when you're in clinical sessions, you should be aware that microaggressions will erode trust in you and will erode feelings of safety. I'm a trauma therapist, and creating safety for my clients is really, really important. So I want to be especially aware of microaggressions. But I don't think you have to be a trauma focused therapist for safety and trust to be important in therapy. I think those are really important regardless. So being aware of microaggressions is something that we need to try and do. We need to know that we hold institutional power in our room, and a client may just not react, may not let us know when we've committed a microaggression. It is our responsibility to be reflecting on that and to be realizing what happened. If we mess up, we need to acknowledge, we need to apologize, we need to not center ourselves, we need to repair, and then we need to move on collaboratively. We need to also make sure that we are making space for clients to discuss microaggressions in their lives. Again, even if they share some lived identities with us, they may experience microaggressions in ways that we don't. And we need to make sure that we're not making assumptions around that and that we're creating space where they can have those conversations with us. So now we're going to move on to implicit bias. And we'll come back again and talk about microaggressions at the very end when we look at some things we can do moving forward. So we're going to start with what is implicit bias. So just like the others, I want you to hear from one of the coiners, and we'll hear from another one of them in just a second as well. But this is Dr. Anthony Greenwald, and he's going to talk just briefly about implicit bias.
The implicit association test, also called the IAT for short, is not your standard kind of psychological test where you're asked to express your attitudes, who you like, don't like, etc. Rather, it asks you to classify either pictures, for instance, pictures of black and white people as black or white, or words meaning pleasant and unpleasant things as pleasant or unpleasant. And it makes inferences from your speed of categorizing these things correctly under a few different conditions to make inferences about associations that exist in your head. These associations are what we call implicit biases. The IAT provides a measure of implicit biases, and one of its main value is to allow people to discover their implicit biases.
That was Dr. Anthony Greenwald talking about the implicit association test, which was really where we started to be able to operationalize and test and really understand implicit bias. We maybe had a concept for it, or at least the researchers had a concept for it before, but this is where we started to be able to prove things around it. And then we're going to hear from another one of the founders, and we're going to hear kind of more about impacts today and some other things about why implicit bias is important, but especially like this one because it talks about implicit bias specifically in the digital age. And we hear a little bit about like concepts around AI and things like that that I think are especially relevant right now.
Ever since the 1970s, at least in my life, I remember having discussions with friends and colleagues about AI and the future. And we are in a moment now when AI is available to us, but also has been introduced into just about every aspect of our lives. We know that the introduction of algorithms in certain decision making can actually be very good. So for places that do health research, they will show us that an algorithm is able to detect a tumor or something X percentage times better than the average radiologist. Very good. If an algorithm is catching more real tumors that a human was missing, that's what we want AI for. But there are many other instances in which AI has become introduced without testing, and where we should have reason to worry and worry quite deeply. There are algorithms that look at facial tics and movements during a job interview, and then those data are fed to the hirer, and somehow it's been interpreted to say that this kind of twitching is not as good as that kind of facial twitching. We have no evidence about the validity of what is being measured. So there's that. Then, of course, there's the problem that algorithms are not transparent. Even the people who wrote those algorithms, the complexity of what is coming out is so great that there is no way, I think even the builders of that would be able to tell you what is it actually doing under the hood. Sometimes fields produce something that could be dangerous. I think that in this case, AI, while everybody's going to use it, there are people who actually build it, and they come from a few different disciplines, but I would say largely these are people who are trained in computer science and in work on AI. What's encouraging to me is that that community is incredibly mindful about the problems of AI. So there are large numbers of people studying bias in AI. There are institutes that are cropping up whose main job it is to focus on these. So I think we will be okay, but only if we don't let corporate interests drive how this work unfolds. If it's being unfolded with one interest, money, we're in deep trouble.
Yeah, so if it's being unfolded with one interest, money, we're in deep trouble. Um, that was Dr. Mazaran Banaji, and we're going to hear from her again here. With the same interview, but a little bit later in the interview, where she was talking a little bit more about implicit bias. So let's get started with that.
When people ask me, what's important about this work? I tend to say, if we know these data on what we call implicit bias, not explicit bias, what if we can show you that by knowing about implicit bias, you will be more likely to make better decisions? So that's point number one. And the second is, I think, an even more persuasive reason. What if I told you that by understanding implicit bias, you will be able to bring your own behavior more in line with your own values? So, my values may be different than somebody else's, but whatever my values are, I'm totally committed to making sure that I behave in line with my values. And the last 50, 60 years of my field of experimental psychology has consistently shown that that is not the case. That people intend well, they speak well, their values read like the constitutions of countries, but when you look at the nitty-gritty behavior, it's not in line. And the reason, and this is the part that I worked on, the reason is that it's not consciously accessible to us. People are not bad people. They're not acting out of malice. They don't hate any group. They're unaware. And they can't be aware until the technology is developed to reveal this to them, what parts of their mind are actually doing. And so my students and I have been at work for the last, like 4 decades or so, doing research to develop methods that will allow us to reveal to ourselves what might have dropped into our heads that we don't even know exists? What is that thumbprint of the culture on my brain that I'm unaware of, but can a test reveal it to me?
There you've heard a little bit about implicit bias from a couple of the key figures. We're going to go on to the definition. According to the Oxford Review, implicit bias refers to the unconscious attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions. Unlike explicit biases, which are intentional and conscious, implicit biases operate beneath the surface, often influencing behavior without individuals even realizing it. These biases can stem from cultural conditioning, societal norms, personal experiences, all shaping our perceptions of race, gender, age, and other social categories. So, heard from the founders, and now we're going to talk about the founders, or the key figures. So, the first one again is Dr. Anthony G. Greenwald. He was born in 1939 in New York, New York. And he's a professor of psychology at the University of Washington. He introduced the implicit association test with a couple of co-authors in 1989 in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, and he co-founded Project Implicit also in 1998. He also won the 2018 U.S. Congress's Golden Goose Award, along with the other two figures that we're going to talk about here in a moment. And then he also won the 2017 APA Award for Distinguished Scientific Contributions to Psychology. So we also talked about or heard from Dr. Mazarin Banaji, and she was born in 1956 in India. She is a professor of psychology at Harvard University. She was really already involved, but she wasn't on that paper. That paper I talk about here, that where Dr. Greenwald introduced the implicit association test. She was not one of the co-authors of that, but she certainly was involved with the work even at that time, and she was one of the co-founders of Project Implicit in 1998, and so was also won that same 2018 U.S. Congress Golden Goose Award. She is the secretary of the Association for Psychological Science and is on the board of scientific affairs of the American Psychological Association. She also just has a myriad. She has had so many fellowships. She has had so many awards. She's in so many positions, on so many boards. I just kind of picked two of them. She is a very busy woman and a very successful woman. So she's an excellent figure to look up to or to look towards as you start your career. And then Dr. Brian Nozak, he was a student. Dr. Banaji was his advisor. And now he's not, but he was born in 1972. He's a professor of psychology at the University of Virginia. He also expanded the implicit association test, so he was around in 1998, but was not on that paper with Dr. Greenwald. And implicit bias theory, he co-founded Project Implicit in 1998 with the other two key figures, and also won that 2018 U.S. Congress Golden Goose Award. He also co-founded the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science and co-founded the Center of Open Science, which you see him wearing a shirt for here in this picture. So these are our key figures, and now we're going to move on to clinical impacts. Why is this important for you? What does implicit bias mean for you and yourself as a therapist? So one of the key things is to remember that everybody has implicit biases, and you are not aware of them unless you've used technology to figure it out, right? Implicit biases are unconscious, they're cultural artifacts, and they may not align with your values. Implicit biases can affect your clinical judgment. And this is why this is really important, is these can affect your clinical judgment. They can affect your risk assessment, and who you give resources to when it comes to risk assessment, right? They can affect your diagnostic impressions. We know, for example, non-white men are much more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia in cases where we normally wouldn't diagnose schizophrenia for white men. And that has to do with implicit biases. And then they also affect our perception of credibility. Who do we consider to be a reliable narrator? Who do we believe when they tell us their stories? And so we really need continued self-reflection and consultation around this that can be helpful. And then also the implicit bias project, which we'll talk about a little bit more at the very end. What does implicit bias mean for your clients? So when you're in clinical sessions, this means that we should really be using protective practices. We should check multiple sources of data and studies. We should not just go with the first study that makes sense or like reaffirms our biases. We should really be trying to do a comprehensive scope when we're trying to work out things like diagnoses and how people are affected by things. We should check assumptions out loud and with colleagues, like invite that feedback, not be defensive about the feedback. And we can openly invite client perspective. I want to check an assumption I might be making. Am I off base? If I could phrase that differently, how would you want me to say it? Are some open-ended questions or some questions that can openly invite client perspective. But again, remember, these are things we often just aren't even aware of. So towards that, we're going to talk about takeaway considerations for both microaggressions and implicit bias. Remember, we are often unaware when we commit microaggressions or when those around us with different identities than us experience microaggressions. Similarly, we are almost always unaware of our implicit biases without tests like the implicit association test. But these biases still shape our actions and choices in ways that may not align with our values. And it is our job to continue to do the lifelong work to combat this. And then looking forward at some activities and trainings that we can do around this. For microaggressions, the NEA has a resource library around both implicit bias and microaggressions and like stereotype resources I encourage you to check out. The National Equity Project also has a responding to microaggressions and unconscious bias page, which has some resources in there and some like links to videos and things like that. I encourage you to check out. For implicit bias, there are some free webinars from the National Equity Project you can go watch. And then there's also the Implicit Project, the Implicit Bias Project. I very much encourage you to go and click on this and go take some of these tests and see where you might have implicit biases. It's really, really neat and really cool. So, that is the end of our introduction to microaggressions and implicit biases. Please let me or your current instructor know if you have any questions, and I am looking forward to learning more about microaggressions and implicit biases with you.